most popular video by far has mic brushing in it, so I'm going to include it again, as there's clearly a large audience that enjoys it. So, today I'm doing the case of Greg Witman. This case was suggested by KENZR5375. So Kenzer 5375. Thank you so much for the suggestion. So, as I mentioned, our victim is Greg Witman. Greg was born on January 31st, 1985 in Baltimore City, Maryland. His parents were Amelia, also known as Sue, and Ron Witman. Greg was the youngest of two boys, with an older brother named Zach. Ron would describe their family of four as a normal American middle-class family. When him and Sue first got married, they weren't sure if Sue was able to have children. So when she became pregnant with Zach, she is said to have been elated. Greg and his brother shared a love of soccer and would bond over this shared interest, with Greg being a member of the Mason-Dixon Under-14 Soccer League. Although they shared this interest, the boys are said to have been extremely different. Greg was known to be social, outgoing, and full of energy, whereas Zach was more introverted and quiet. At the time of Greg's death, he was an 8th grade student at Southern Middle School in Glen Rock. In addition to being in a soccer league, Greg is said to have been an actively involved student in many school social activities. So it sounds like he was just an outgoing, happy, fun, and well-liked young man. I normally like to talk more about the victims, but in this case, because he was only 13 at the time of his death, there's not a ton of information on Greg, unfortunately. But I've included what I was able to find. So, we get to the events of October 3rd, 1998. So, on this day, Zach was not feeling well and he ended up staying home from school. For him, the day would be rather uneventful. He said he spent most of the day in bed, sleeping or watching TV. Greg went to school as usual, and there was a football game that night for the high school's football team. So apparently the students were buzzing Greg and his attacker would struggle near the front entrance and move into the living room area. They would eventually end up in the laundry room where Greg would be stabbed to death. So just a minute before Greg got home at 3:09, Greg's girlfriend Erin would call the house, and she said that somebody picked up and hung up. She said that she knew someone picked up because the phone made a sound when it was picked up, and so she heard that distinctive sound and knew the call didn't just drop or something, that somebody had actually picked it up and that it was hung up. At 3:15, Erin would call for a second time, and this time Zach would answer. She asked to speak to Greg, and Zach mentioned that he wasn't home yet and to call back later. She noted that Zach seemed normal through this call, that he wasn't out of breath, didn't seem frantic or upset at all. But just 2 minutes later, Zach would call 911 in hysterics. He tells the dispatcher, "I came downstairs and the door was cracked and he was lying there, just lying there," he said, before breaking into an anguished scream. "Gone, gone, gone, gone. Why? He tells the dispatcher his brother was suffering, and the dispatcher asks him to roll his brother's body over. After doing so, Zach became understandably more hysterical, and at that point asks to hang up the phone so that he can call his mother. So police arrive at 3:25, and they find Zach with blood on his sweater, as well as on his hands and on the phone that he used to call 911. They note in police reports that Zach is in an excited state and seems quite frantic. Zach would tell police that he was upstairs sleeping and he heard the front door open and close. He says he then heard what sounded like a struggle and a noise that sounded like someone being thrown against a wall. So he went downstairs to investigate, and he saw blood on the floor in the foyer, and he noticed that the foyer table was broken. He followed the blood marks, which ultimately led him to the laundry room, where he says he found his brother laying in a pool of his own blood on the floor. At approximately 3:45, Zach would be brought to the hospital to be examined. In the ambulance, they would take his sweatshirt and socks and bag them as evidence. His hands Zach responded, "I never would have hurt Greg. I loved Greg, and from that moment on, she made the decision to fully believe in Zach's innocence." By about 8 p.m., Ron was at the hospital and he was informed that Sue had been sedated because she was so upset. So he went to find Zach himself. He would also ask Zach if he had anything to do with his brother's death, and Zach held firm on his innocence. As with Sue, Ron's belief in his son's innocence has never wavered since. Now, during the autopsy, they would come to find out that Greg had been stabbed more than 100 times, with approximately 60 of those being in the neck. There were a total of 25 deep defensive wounds on Greg's hands, 9 to the right hand and 16 to the left. Upon canvassing the crime scene and While Zach was on trial, he would live at his parents' home on house arrest, so he had to wear a bracelet or an anklet. But his parents would maintain his innocence, insisting Zach could not and would not have done this. So the defense would challenge much of the evidence, and their initial defense was to try and throw out many different items of evidence. So they brought 50 different items that they were trying to suppress the evidence on. So they claimed in part that a search warrant wasn't properly obtained, and that the family did not give proper consent to search the property. They say that a minor cannot give consent to search a home, and that only the evidence seen from the scene of the crime should be admissible. They claimed without the other evidence, the case should be thrown out. So one of the items they tried to have thrown out was the 911 call that was obviously being used as evidence. And they would claim that Zach had a reasonable right to privacy. Of the 50 items that they requested be suppressed, only 16 would ultimately be ruled as inadmissible, and the overall search of the property was ruled to be valid and executed legally. The 911 phone call was also ruled to be fully admissible. The defense would use forensic experts to testify that the murder weapon could not have been used to kill Greg, that it was too small and flimsy. They claim the blood on Zach's clothes was from turning the body over as instructed by the 911 operator, and that there wasn't enough blood on the clothes to have been the clothes worn when the murder took place. When investigators interviewed neighbors, they claimed they saw a suspicious vehicle leaving the neighborhood around the time the murder took place. So they threw that in there to try and shed weight on the claim that somebody else did this. With regards to Greg's girlfriend Erin calling the house, the defense would argue that if Zach killed Greg, he would have had to have been in the middle of it, specializes in knife and gun cases, would come out to say, "That's incredible beating this knife was able to withstand." So in 2018, a York County judge would end up throwing out Zach's initial conviction and sentence after Zach's new attorney discovered that prior counsel had never discussed an offer that was made to his client. Instead of standing trial again, Zach pleaded guilty in exchange for a lesser sentence. So after 15 years of maintaining his innocence, Zach says, "Yes, I can say I killed my brother by stabbing." He would tell authorities that when Erin called at 3:09 looking for Greg, Zach had hung up on her. He says Greg was angry about this and continued to instigate confrontation repeatedly. He says he got the penknife and gloves and was intending to just scare Greg, but instead the confrontation led to a physical altercation, and he says he stabbed his brother once in the neck, resulting in the foyer table breaking. He says that Greg then tried to escape by running in the direction of the laundry room, and he was trying to get out the back door, but that Zach got up to him and stabbed him repeatedly until he was dead. So, in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juvenile killers was cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore unconstitutional. So, in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court took the next step and clarified that the 2012 ruling should be applied retroactively to all juvenile lifer cases. So any juveniles that had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. So this would affect Zach's initial sentencing, as he was a minor when he received life and parole. So after he pled guilty in 2018, on February 8th, he was resentenced to a minimum of 15 years and 230 days in prison, with a maximum sentence of 70 years. 40 years, not 70, 40 years. On January 18th, 2019, as a result of time served and good behavior, Zach was granted parole, with his earliest release date being May 21st. The parole board said Zach completed an institutional program and had a positive attitude during his time incarcerated. At 9 a.m. on Tuesday, May 21st, 2019, Zach was released on parole. He was 36 at the time of his release and spent 16 years in jail. After living in the same home where Greg was killed for years, Ron and Sue have since moved to a more rural Pennsylvania town where they reside with Zach. To this day, they stand by him and believe his innocence. Sue would publicly say, after Zach's release, that she did not want to discuss the facts of the case. At one point, without elaborating, she said Zach took a plea to get out of prison. So she's implying that Zach's innocent and he only took the plea deal to get out of jail. So despite saying she didn't want to discuss the facts of the case anymore, in 2020 they would release a documentary called The Witmans, where they would continue with this narrative of trying to prove Zach's innocence. In a news release, the great story, and we are hopeful that this documentary will provide a critical look at the fractured policies of youth incarceration in America. Private investigator Jeff Stein, who was also a friend of the family, would tell the Daily Record that he'd been working with the documentary crew since 2015 and still believed Zach was innocent, but that he took the plea deal because it was a sure thing. In the documentary, they interview a woman who claims that a man made comments to her about how somebody should kill the rich kids in the neighborhood and hide the evidence. And apparently this was not long before the murder in 1998. This woman is not named and only partially appears on camera in the documentary, and says she called a tip line that family members set up seeking information about this case. So I don't know if she ever spoke to authorities and gave them this information, but she speaks of it in the documentary anonymously, so I would assume that this was brought to authorities and looked into. She says during the documentary that the man went to her house, pulled out a pocket knife, and started cleaning his fingernails with it. He stated, "I have one at home that is really sharp," and then remarked, "Man, it would cut your throat in a second." He made a really harsh comment that somebody ought to kill these rich kids, hide the evidence, and no one would ever know about it. She remembers being scared after the murder. The man, she said, moved out of the neighborhood after the killing, and he is not identified in the documentary. So, I have some questions that I would like to bring up to those people who still claim that Zach is innocent. So if you look at photos of the knife, I think it's pretty clear that it's more than capable of being able to commit this murder. Although it's not a large knife, it's still a sharp object, and if you stab someone in the neck with any sharp object, even if it's just an X-Acto knife, if you do that over 100 times, you for sure can inflict enough damage to end someone's life. So I find that claim absolutely ridiculous that they don't think it's possible. The next question I have is, if a random person did this, why would they have been wearing youth sporting gloves? That makes no sense. Also, if Zach didn't do this, who did? What motive would someone have for randomly attacking and killing a 13-year-old boy, but leaving his brother completely unharmed upstairs? Now, maybe you'll say he didn't know that anyone was upstairs, which I guess is possible, but again, why would you murder a 13-year-old boy? You know, there was no essay involved at all. There was no robbery. There just seems like zero motive website online with an obituary of his that had some details about his life. One website. Aside from that, I couldn't find people talking about Greg. His parents only talk about Zach. Every article they do, every interview they do, all they talk about is Zach. They don't talk about the son that they lost. They don't honor his legacy by telling the world how great of a son he was and how he's the true victim in this, not Zach. So honestly, I know I don't know these parents personally, but I really shake my head and I'm angry that they aren't honoring their son more and that they've made this completely all about Zach. So I do like to end with some kind words from the family or friends about Greg. But aside from what I wrote in that initial little summary of Greg and who he was as a child, I have no quotes from his family or friends speaking of Greg, because all they talk about is Zach and how Zach is innocent. And it's really sad, and shame on them, honestly, for not doing a better job of, as I said, honoring your son that's no longer here. He should be put first above your son who very clearly murdered your other child. But even if you believe in Zach's innocence, Greg is still the victim here and deserves